If you are asked what comes to mind when you think about Africa, chances of familiar images appear immediately: poor villages, undernourished children, drought, war, humanitarian aid. Those images are not entirely wrong, but they have never been the whole story. Now try to imagine a different scene. A farmer in rural Africa pulls an old mobile phone from his pocket. No bank, no credit card, just a few taps on the screen, and money is transferred instantly, faster than many transactions in New York or Los Angeles. Not far away, a drone flies across the sky carrying blood and vaccines, landing precisely at its destination within minutes. This is not a science fiction movie. It is everyday life. At the same time, in a coastal city, a lavish party is taking place. Supercars lined up, imported wine, luxury apartments facing the ocean, worth millions of dollars. Not in Europe, not in Dubai, but in Africa. These two images exist side by side, and it is this coexistence that confuses many people. Why does a continent so often associated with poverty also produce billionaires, financial hubs, and technology models that the rest of the world studies? Why does a place labeled underdeveloped lead in mobile payments, renewable energy, and adaptive solutions that wealthy countries are still struggling to build? The answer is not found in sensational headlines, nor in short news segments. It lies in how the story of Africa has been told, and in what has been left outside the frame. For decades, the world has grown used to viewing Africa through a single lens: crisis. But when you see a place only through crisis, you miss the most important thing: how people adapt, innovate, and endure. You do not see cities growing at breathtaking speed. You do not see communities using technology more flexibly than almost anywhere else. And you do not understand why the future of the world, demographically, in resources, in ideas, is so tightly bound to this continent. This video does not aim to deny the challenges Africa faces. Instead, it does something more important. It places those challenges in their proper context. It shows what exists alongside poverty, what is growing quietly, and what is rarely told in full, because if you only know half the story, you misunderstand the entire picture. And perhaps, after watching this video, you will realize that Africa is not a continent left behind, but a place the world has looked at too simply, for far too long. In reality, Africa is the youngest continent in the world. More than half of its population is under 25. That means enormous pressure on jobs, education, and infrastructure. But it also means something else that is rarely emphasized: social energy. In many countries, young people do not have the patience to wait for old systems to change. They are forced to find their own paths. And in that gap, new models emerge. Look at how money is used. In many regions, traditional banking systems do not reach the population. Opening an account is difficult. Fees are high. Procedures are complex. But, instead of accepting exclusion from the formal economy, people choose another route. Mobile phones become banks. Text messages become transactions, and an entirely new financial ecosystem forms, without branches, without counters, without glass buildings. What is striking is that these solutions did not come from luxury laboratories or giant technology corporations. They came from very real needs. When there is no choice, people are forced to innovate, and that innovation often becomes more direct, more efficient, and less cumbersome than the complex systems of wealthy nations. Alongside finance is the story of cities. Many African cities are expanding at a pace that leaves urban planners stunned. Areas that were once empty land become commercial centers, residential districts, technology hubs. A middle class is forming, with familiar needs: better housing, education for children, healthcare, entertainment, travel. This is not the image that appears on evening news, but it is happening every day. The existence of African billionaires is often seen as an anomaly, even an irritation, for those accustomed to the image of a poor continent. In reality, it reflects something basic: where there is a market, there are people who grow rich. Many industries in Africa develop in conditions of limited international competition, large domestic demand, and rapid population growth. This creates opportunities that no longer exist in saturated economies. However, that wealth is not evenly distributed, and this inequality is often used to reinforce stereotypes. When people see a slum next to a luxury neighborhood, the quick conclusion is that the system has failed. But the more important question is, which system? The global economic system, the colonial legacy, or internal political structures? Without asking the right question, every answer remains superficial. Another often overlooked aspect is how Africa adapts to infrastructure constraints. When roads are poor, drones deliver medical supplies. When the power grid is unstable, small-scale solar energy is deployed at the household level. When schools are insufficient, mobile-based online learning is used with remarkable flexibility. These solutions are not perfect, but they reveal a different mindset, not waiting for everything to be complete before acting. This leads to an interesting paradox. Many wealthy countries are trying to innovate by dismantling old, bloated systems. In Africa, the absence of entrenched systems becomes an advantage. Societies can leap directly to new models, skipping intermediate stages. What economists call leapfrogging is not an abstract theory here, it is the daily experience of millions. So why are these stories rarely told in full? Partly because they do not fit familiar narratives. Partly because bad news attracts more attention than good news. But more deeply, because the way we tell global stories relies on simplification. Africa is reduced to a symbol, rather than seen as a complex collection of dozens of countries, hundreds of languages, and billions of lived experiences. This section does not aim to paint a rosy picture. Problems of inequality, governance, conflict, and the environment are real. But what matters is understanding that these problems exist alongside growth, innovation, and aspiration. When we see only one side, we not only misunderstand Africa, we misunderstand how the world works in the 21st century, and this is the core point. Africa is not an outlier outside the global development trajectory. It is part of the trajectory, moving along its own path, at its own pace, with its own solutions. If we want to understand the future of global economics, technology, and society, ignoring this continent is not just an oversight, it is a strategic mistake. In popular thinking, development is often measured by concrete things: GDP, factories, highways, multinational corporations. But in many African countries, development does not follow a straight line. It is fragmented, uneven, sometimes chaotic, but therefore flexible. Instead of building complete systems based on Western models, many communities choose solutions that are good enough to solve immediate problems, and that creates a form of progress that is hard to see from the outside, but extremely effective for those living within it. Take healthcare. In remote rural areas, where hospitals are dozens or even hundreds of kilometers away, healthcare cannot resemble New York or Boston. Time is life or death. A stroke, a complicated birth, a child needing blood urgently. In that context, the question is not how many hospitals to build, but how to deliver what is needed to the right place at the right time. And the answers sometimes come from solutions that appear simple yet highly disruptive. Drones are not symbols of luxury technology here. They are tools. They replace unfinished roads and journeys that take hours or days. What matters is that these systems are not designed to impress. They are designed to work in real conditions: harsh weather, limited infrastructure, tight budgets. Their success lies not in how advanced they look, but in solving the core problem. Education shows the same logic. In many places, schools are insufficient, teachers are scarce, classrooms overcrowded. Instead of waiting for large top-down reforms, communities use mobile technology to fill the gaps. Phones become textbooks, classrooms, and connections. Students learn at their own pace, adapting to family circumstances. This model is imperfect, but it demonstrates something crucial. When formal systems fail to meet demand, society creates parallel systems. The same applies to energy. In many African countries, national power grids are unreliable or incomplete. Rather than seeing this as an insurmountable obstacle, People and small businesses turn to decentralized solutions. Solar panels on rooftops, small storage systems, community mini-grids. No need to wait for billion-dollar projects. Energy becomes accessible step by step, household by household. Interestingly, these models are now drawing attention from policymakers and businesses in developed countries. As climate change, energy crises, and supply chain disruptions become global issues, centralized thinking shows its limits. What were once seen as temporary fixes in Africa are now viewed as valuable experiments for the future. But development is not only about technology or infrastructure. It is also about how society organizes life. In many African communities, the individual is tightly bound to the collective. Extended families, villages, and social networks function as informal welfare systems. When the state is not strong enough to cover every risk, these relationships help people survive crises. This does not mean there are no problems, but it shows a form of social resilience that economic indicators rarely capture. This resilience explains why many African societies can endure major shocks without completely collapsing. Political crises, price fluctuations, natural disasters. Each time, formal systems may falter, but daily life continues. Small markets stay open. Exchange networks function. Temporary solutions emerge. This is not stagnation. It is adaptation. However, this adaptation is often misunderstood. From the outside, it can look like acceptance of the status quo. From the inside, it is a survival strategy in an uncertain environment. And when conditions change, these strategies can quickly turn into engines of growth. History shows that many economies grew fastest not when everything was perfect, but when people were already skilled at improvisation. Another under-discussed factor is culture's role in innovation. Linguistic, social, and lifestyle diversity is not just anthropological color. It directly shapes how ideas form and spread. On a continent with thousands of cultural groups, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Models must be flexible and context-specific, and that flexibility is precisely what rigid systems often lack. Seen through this lens, the story changes completely. This is no longer about catching up or falling behind. It is about parallel paths. A continent not following the same route wealthy nations once took, but not standing still either. It is experimenting, discarding, adjusting, and moving forward in its own way. The problem is that these movements are slow, scattered, and rarely produce dramatic moments worthy of headlines. They do not fit the pace of fast news, but ignoring them means missing important signals about how the world is changing from the ground up. For decades, the relationship between Africa and the wealthy world followed a familiar order. Developed nations produced capital, technology, governance models. Africa received, adapted, and remained largely dependent. That order is now showing visible cracks, not because Africa suddenly became rich or unified, but because the global context has changed in ways that make what was once seen as weakness look flexible. Start with demographics. While many developed countries are aging rapidly, Africa is entering a youth population boom. This is often framed as a ticking time bomb, but from another angle, it is the largest source of labor, consumption, and ideas for decades to come. Global companies see this. Governments see this. Africa sees this too. The difference lies in how each prepares, then resources. Not just oil or traditional minerals, but materials critical to the new economy, rare metals, battery components, renewable energy inputs. As the world shifts away from fossil fuels, Africa's role is not shrinking, it is being reshaped. This gives African countries leverage to negotiate, rather than simply extract and export at low value. Negotiation matters only when options exist. And this time, Africa has more options. The diversification of international partnerships is a structural shift. Instead of relying on a few power centers, many African countries actively balance multiple partners. This does not always produce ideal outcomes, but it breaks the old logic of being forced down a single path. More partners mean more room to negotiate, and more room means greater autonomy. Another key change is Africa's participation in the global economy, not just as a supplier, but as a market. With hundreds of millions of new consumers each decade, the continent is no longer an afterthought. It becomes a testing ground for products, services, and business models. Many companies realize that if a solution works in Africa's complex conditions, it can work anywhere. This reverses the old logic where models were designed in the West and exported outward. This reversal appears in policy as well. Lessons about risk management, climate adaptation, and living with instability are increasingly discussed in international forums, and many come from experiences Africa has long lived with, not by choice, but by necessity. As instability becomes a global norm, experience in managing it becomes an asset. Power, however, never rises without tension. Africa's growing role brings new competition. Major powers are interested not only in resources and markets, but in political influence, norms, and development paths. African countries face a difficult challenge: how to benefit from increased attention without losing control. There is no simple solution, and history offers many failures. What is different now is awareness. Questions about long-term benefit, economic sovereignty, and internal value are being raised more often and more openly. Another subtle but deep shift is how young Africans see the world. This generation grows up globally connected, yet deeply local. They do not simply absorb external values, they select, remix, and redefine them. African culture, music, fashion, and entrepreneurship increasingly circulate globally, not as copies but as distinct voices. This is a form of soft power that is hard to measure but long-lasting. From a US and Western perspective, this change challenges old thinking. Africa can no longer be approached merely as a region to be helped, or a chessboard for influence. That approach is increasingly outdated. Africa must be seen as a complex partner, with its own interests, priorities, and limits. This requires patience, understanding, and respect, qualities that do not always align with short political cycles. But the biggest challenge may not be policy. It is perception. When images of Africa remain dominated by old stories, strategic analysis lacks foundation. You cannot build lasting relationships with a place you do not truly understand. And you cannot understand it through a single lens. Stereotypes are not built overnight. They form over decades, even centuries, through colonial history, the Cold War, televised humanitarian crises, and selective information flows. Each disaster in Africa receives intense coverage. Each quiet improvement is treated as an exception, not enough to change the narrative. Over time, repetition becomes truth in collective perception. The problem is not only media, but audience reception. People seek stories that confirm existing beliefs. If someone believes Africa equals poverty and instability, they easily accept images that reinforce that belief and ignore contradictions. This is not personal failure, it is a common psychological mechanism. But when it operates globally, the consequences are large. The first consequence is flawed policy. When a region is seen mainly as a place to rescue, solutions focus on short-term relief rather than root causes. This does not mean aid is useless, but that aid without deep understanding can unintentionally reinforce dependency. A society constantly treated as a victim struggles to be seen as an equal partner. The second consequence is missed opportunity. While many cling to old images, others already see potential. Businesses, investors, and creative communities quietly build new relationships with Africa, not out of charity, but mutual interest. The gap between common perception and reality creates space, and that space is often filled by those willing to look beyond bias. The deepest consequence may be the narrowing of Western understanding itself. When a continent of billions is reduced to a simple image, our worldview becomes limited. We start believing there is only one development path, one correct model, and everything else is an inferior version. This is not only inaccurate, it is intellectually dangerous. Africa, in all its contradictions, directly challenges that belief. It shows that development can take many forms, that innovation does not require wealth, but often emerges from scarcity, that adaptability can matter more than system perfection. These lessons are not only for Africa, but for a world entering prolonged instability. Notably, the challenges Africa has lived with for decades are now becoming familiar elsewhere: political instability, supply chain disruption, energy crises, climate change. What were once someone else's problems are now shared experiences. In this context, Africa's adaptive experience is no longer peripheral. It is a key reference. To recognize this properly requires a shift in storytelling, not replacing one extreme image with another, not turning Africa into an idealized paradise, but accepting complexity, accepting that a place can face crisis and generate solutions at the same time, can fail seriously and succeed meaningfully. Only then does the story reflect reality. This is also a reminder that stereotypes harm not only those stereotyped, but those who hold them. When we frame the world through familiar templates, we refuse the chance to learn from different paths. And in a rapidly changing world, that refusal can become a weakness. Ultimately, Africa's story is not just about a continent. It is a mirror reflecting how we understand globalization, power, and progress. It asks whether we are willing to update our beliefs as reality changes, whether we are humble enough to admit that places once seen as behind may be ahead in crucial ways. Seen this way, Africa is no longer an exception to be explained. It becomes an essential part of an emerging global picture, one that is less orderly, less comfortable, but full of opportunity for those willing to look deeper. Throughout this video, Africa is not portrayed as something to praise, nor as something to pity. It is placed where it belongs, a continent in motion, full of contradictions, experiments, and undefined paths. And if there is one conclusion to draw, it is this: the story of Africa has never been only about Africa. It is a story about how power shapes perception, about how major information centers decide what is told, what is omitted, and what is repeated until it becomes obvious truth. For decades, the world has viewed Africa from the outside, through lenses of crisis and lack. Those lenses once reflected part of reality, but when left unchanged, they become distortion. What is striking is how quietly this distortion happens: through daily news habits, simplified education, familiar images repeated over time. Gradually, a complex continent is compressed into a simple symbol, and when a place becomes a symbol, real people disappear from the story. But the world is entering a phase where old symbols no longer explain reality. Crises pile up, systems once thought stable reveal limits, and models once considered universal begin to wobble. In that context, societies long accustomed to instability and adaptation hold a form of knowledge that money cannot buy. Africa, with all its challenges, is among them, not because it chose hardship, but because history imposed it, and that history produced a different understanding of risk, community, and living with uncertainty. As instability becomes global, this experience is no longer marginal. This raises a deeper question beyond the video: who is truly ahead in the 21st century? Societies with the most assets, or societies that know how to survive when assets no longer guarantee safety? Systems optimized for stability, or systems built to adapt to volatility? There is no simple answer, but asking the question itself is progress. It forces a re-examination of assumptions once considered obvious. It forces recognition that the world does not develop in a straight line, and that detours sometimes lead to critical destinations. This ending is also a reminder that changing perception is not a one-time act. It is an ongoing process. Each time we encounter a new story about a distant place, we choose to fit it into old frames, or to set those frames aside and listen. The second choice requires more effort, but yields deeper understanding. Africa does not need to be rebranded to be worthy of attention. It needs to be seen more fully. That fullness includes failures, contradictions, and unresolved limits, but it also includes creativity, vitality, and daily experimentation, even when rarely acknowledged. In the end, the story returns to the viewer, not to demand agreement, but to invite self-reflection. When you hear about a place, a people, or a society different from your own, how many lenses are you using? From where are you looking? And why do you trust what you see? Because in a connected world, Misunderstanding is not only a moral issue, it is a strategic one. Major decisions are made based on perception. And when perception is flawed decisions follow. This video does not offer a closed conclusion. It opens a door. Behind that door is a world more complex, less comfortable, but more real. If you step through it, you may not only see Africa differently, you may see the entire world differently, and perhaps that is the greatest value of telling stories that were never fully told, not to change the subject of the story, but to change the one who is listening. Looking back at the entire journey of this video, one thing becomes clear: Africa is not a story of prolonged failure, nor a tale of miraculous revival. It is an unfinished process, a process marked by heavy history, yet opening possibilities not yet shaped. And precisely because it is unfinished, it is often misunderstood. People prefer stories with clear beginnings and endings. A place poor, then rich, a society backward, then modern. But the real world rarely follows that script. Africa, in particular, resists linear storytelling. Here, past and future exist side by side. A village without stable electricity may use advanced mobile payments. A fast-growing city may sit next to an area lacking clean water. These contradictions are not exceptions. They are structure. When this structure is rejected, simplification follows. Africa becomes a symbol of poverty, or, conversely, an idealized new promised land. Both views are incomplete. Both serve the storyteller's needs more than the lived reality of people inside. This section does not ask you to replace one stereotype with another. It invites something simpler and harder. Accept that some places cannot be understood through a single story. That truth often lives in the middle, where headlines are inconvenient, emotions are muted, but long-term direction is decided. If Africa is teaching the world anything, it is how to live with uncertainty. While societies accustomed to control struggle with new volatility, Africa has never known certainty. That does not make life easier, but it builds psychological and social flexibility. When systems cannot be trusted, people rely on one another. When long-term plans are fragile, short-term adaptation becomes essential. The world is entering an era where these skills are no longer rare. Climate change, pandemics, geopolitical conflict, technological disruption, risks once considered local are now shared. In that context, societies long accustomed to limits may hold an invisible advantage. Not immunity to crisis, but familiarity with survival within it. This does not mean Africa will automatically become the world's center. There is no inevitable path. But it does mean that continuing to view Africa through outdated lenses is increasingly dangerous cognitively. It causes us to miss early signals, important experiments, and quiet shifts shaping the future. This ending also raises a question about responsibility, of storytellers and listeners alike. In an information-saturated world, choosing which stories to tell is an act of power. But, choosing which stories to believe is equally powerful. Each time we share, comment on, or nod along with a familiar image, we help sustain or challenge long-standing frames. This video does not ask you to agree with everything said, nor does it ask for blind optimism about Africa. It asks only for caution in judgment. Before concluding about a place, a society, or a people, ask whether you have truly seen enough, because understanding does not come from passively accumulating information. It comes from being willing to adjust the frame when new information appears. And in this era, frames become outdated faster than we expect. When the video ends, what remains is not a list of achievements or a development ranking. What remains is an open question for each viewer. If what you once believed about Africa reflects only part of the truth, how many other places in the world are you also seeing through incomplete lenses? You may not find an answer immediately. You may never find a complete one. But asking the question itself is already a shift. It opens the possibility of seeing the world not as a collection of familiar templates, but as a complex network of paths, choices, and consequences. And if, after watching this video, you begin to look at news, maps, and global stories with a bit more healthy skepticism, a bit more curiosity, then the video has achieved its purpose, not to deliver truth, but to awaken thought, not to close a story, but to let it continue in how you see the world from tomorrow onward.